I was watching the movie Skyfall the other day. It is a series in the James Bond movies. I am a big James Bond fan. I've always liked the James Bond movies, but in this movie Skyfall, at one point, James Bond, played by Daniel Craig, in that movie comes back from the dead. Now, of course, he wasn't raised like Lazarus was, but in the previous episode, he was shot, fell into a waterfall, and was presumed dead. As he floated downstream, he found himself running from a life of espionage, changing his life, desiring something different in his life, and the opening scene of the movie Skyfall cuts to him on some island somewhere, living a life not as James Bond. It got me thinking about this idea of faking your own death. And I thought, what a crazy concept. But as I Google searched it, there are a lot of people over years, who have faked their own death. In fact, you can go down to the list of people who have claimed that they had drowned and they disappeared. And a lot of times in these concepts, they're running from something. In fact, at one point, Olivia Newton-John's, at the time, husband had faked his own death. And it became major headlines because he was running from things, whether it was having to pay child support, or several of the ones I looked up were running from the accusation of jail time, or major tax money being owed, or in James Bond's case, a life of espionage that he felt he could no longer handle. And they faked their own death so they didn't have to live how they used to live. And as you think about that concept of living a different life after faking a death, is exactly what Dan was alluding to in Romans chapter 6. This idea of dying to self, to live for Christ. We had a service last week that I heard from several of you, and I felt the same way, that was very powerful. As we looked at the crucifixion of Christ, as we looked at what that was and what the moments were leading up to that moment, let me ask you a question. Does the crucifixion of Christ cause a desire of change in your life? There are many things that happen in our lives that cause what we like to call paradigm shifts. It's a complete change of thinking or an outlook on how we look at things. As a parent, you remember holding your child for the first time? The world looked different that day. I'll never forget, I've always kind of lived life on the edge behind the wheel. I'll never forget driving my first baby home from the hospital. I made sure that car seat was just right. I made sure she was tied just right, buckled in just right. And I probably drove 10 miles an hour under the speed limit all the way home that day. Because that was a life-changing experience for me. Some of these life-changing experiences these people have had that have faked their own death caused them to run away from life. They desired a change in their life to the point of, I don't want to be who I used to be. I want to take on a different life and a different name and live in a different place and have a different family because I no longer want what I used to have. And it was a complete change in their life. When we look at the crucifixion of Christ, it should make us change. Paul says, transformed. And if you look at that word transformed that Paul uses in the book of Romans, it's this metamorphosis. It's a complete change. It's not who we used to be. It's a completely different person of who we used to be. And as we look at this word crucify this morning, my challenge is, have you crucified the old self? We looked at this idea last week of Jesus on the cross, and I think tradition and I think culture has caused us to truly forget what a crucifixion was. If I were to say crucifixion, probably most of us immediately say Jesus, if we had a word association to it. But the crucifixion was a form of a capital punishment. Literally, the crucifixion was something that was brought about and perfected by the Romans, but not only the Romans. There were nations of people who did it before the Romans, and it was designed to bring perfect shame and perfect torture and ultimately death to the one they hung on that cross. So I'd like to look at the word crucify this morning as a synonym for death. Because that's what it is. When we think of the word crucify and we read passages like Romans chapter 6 or the book of Colossians when Paul references it, or Galatians chapter 2 in verse 20, or even later on in Galatians chapter 5, he uses the word crucify as a form of dying to. It's not this thing that we think about today and we hang crosses around our neck and we put them on our Bibles and we put them on wall art and we wear them on our shirts. It was an awful form of execution then. And it realized death. We glorify the cross. Unfortunately, sometimes too much. Because what the cross did was necessary. But it wouldn't have had the effect if the man who was hanging on it wasn't Christ. And we have to remember that when we think about what happened on that cross and what he did for us. And I think if we really understand what he did for us on that cross, it should cause us to have a desire to crucify self. There's a lot of interesting ideas when you think about the idea of what Paul presents in Romans chapter 6 and then also in Galatians chapter 2. But when Paul presents this idea, and it's really as simple as this: we must die to live. And we hear those words today, and it becomes confusing for us. In fact, we may even call it an oxymoronic statement. How can one die to live? When something dies, we rid ourselves of it, right? A tree in your yard dies. What do? You just leave it there and look at the beauty of its death? No, we cut it down and we burn it up. It has no purpose anymore. But something recently has happened around our area that I think provides an illustration for this. How many of you guys love fall? How many of you guys love mowing up all those leaves all the time? Right? No hands. But do you know that for the livelihood of those trees, it's crucial for them for their leaves to die? If they didn't lose the leaves, they would freeze and kill the tree. And the tree will only come back in the spring if the leaves die in the fall. And it paints an illustration for us of the necessity in our lives for us to die in order to live. So I want to work through Galatians chapter 2 and verse 20 this morning. It's perfectly broken out with 3 sentences in one verse that I believe outlines for us and defines for us what it means for us to be crucified to self. Paul in Galatians chapter 2 and verse 20 says, "For I have been crucified with Christ. It's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And the life that I now live in this flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me." In fact, we could take this one verse and define our lives by it. This one verse has so much power that if we can truly understand what Paul is trying to make us know through his inspiration, what God is telling us, it can change our lives. So let's break it down to the first part. I have been crucified, yet I live. When you made that commitment one day to give up self, to seek first the kingdom of God, his rule in your life. When you that one day heard of the truth of Christ and the gospel of his death, his burial, and his resurrection, and you understood what the concept was when sin separates you from God, and you understood the magnitude of the wrath of God, and one day you said, I need to have Christ as my king, as my ruler. That day, did you die to self? Did you say on that day, and every day since then, today, I'm not living for me? It's interesting when you think of sin, and whenever you pair a list of sins that is written in the Bible, whether it's Paul writing it or another writer, maybe it's Christ listing off these sins in our life. Do you know what the major factor that combines all the sins together is? Selfish ambition. Selfish ambition is the root of the sin that we have. Every single time. And I think if we understand that, we can understand the significance of what Paul's trying to get us to understand of dying to self. Because when I die to self, it's not about making me look better, it's about making him look better. And when I die to self, it's not about getting mine, but I want to make sure you get yours. And when I die to self, I don't want people to look at me, I want my actions to point them to Christ. And when I die to self, it's not about my own pleasure. It's about living a life that glorifies him. When I die to self, it's always putting everybody else first. When I die to self, I'm going to be the husband that God needs me to be. That always puts her first. The dad that my kids need me to be. The brother that you need me to be. It's not about my own selfish ambition when I die to self, and just like it wasn't about Christ. Notice his prayer in the garden in Matthew. If it be your will, let this cup pass from me. If it be your will, God. It never was about him for him. Even when he was dying on the cross, he was thinking of his mother. John, please take care of her. When he prepared that Passover meal, he was thinking of his apostles. When he prayed that high priestly prayer in John chapter 17, he's praying for his apostles and his believers because it was all about everybody else for Christ. Philippians chapter 2 tells us he humbled himself even to the point of death. So when we think about this first statement in this verse, for I've been crucified with Christ, yet I live. When you take over Romans chapter 6 and what Paul is trying to illustrate in the first 4 verses, and then picks up in verse 5, it's not the idea of me living for sin, but it's me dying to sin to live for Christ. Guys, we cannot live until we die. We cannot live for him until we die. And that's something we constantly have to do. Every day we wake up and we should be praying this prayer. Today, let your spirit work through me. Today, let me die to the sin that are in my life. Every day we should be praying that prayer. Because I know, as well as you, we're human. And maybe that day we decided to make Christ our King, and we got in that watery grave of baptism, and we came up out of that watery grave, and like he says in Romans chapter 6 and verse 4, to walk in that newness of life. We were all about it. But the next day and the next day and the next day, there were times in our life that we become all about self. It's all about what I can get. It's all about what I can provide to me, to make me happy, to suit my pleasures, to suit my passions, to make sure I'm taken care of. But that's not the Christian way. The first step is that I must die. I must be crucified so I can live. And then he continues on in the very next sentence and tells us that no longer do I live for myself, but I live for him. This is an interesting concept because we may not understand what that means on surface levels. What do you mean I live for him and not myself? I'm also told to love myself and take care of myself. But you're telling me I'm supposed to live for him? Yes, on both accounts. Because everything I do should look like him. Everything. Everything I do should look like him. Everything I say should point people to him. Every action I make should point people to him. In fact, 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 20, Paul makes this statement that we are to be ambassadors for Christ. And if I look at this idea that I'm no longer living for me, but living for him, essentially, I'm becoming an ambassador for Christ. I want people to look at me and see Christ. I want people to fall in love with Christ because of what I say and how I act and how I live my life. And we should, church, look different. We should look different. And I'm going to tell you something. I don't care if you wear the name Christian, because there's a lot of people in this world that wear the name Christian that aren't ambassadors for Christ. And I will tell you something else. That's the first thing that's going to turn people away from Christ, is when we say we are and we don't look like him. And that's scary. In fact, I'm thinking Satan today uses that against us. When we say, well, what did you do this weekend? Well, I went to church on Sunday, and now they see us doing something that doesn't look like Christ. I've been crucified with Christ. It's no longer me that I live for, but now every day I live for him. I am an ambassador for Christ. And if you don't think people are watching, they are. In fact, I'm convinced that as soon as you say you are, they watch harder. I've always been afraid of the statement that Paul makes in 1 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse 1. When he says, therefore be imitators of me as I am of Christ. Maybe I could ask a hard question. Maybe I could ask this question and ask, would you be so bold and willing to post that on your Facebook feed today? Therefore, be imitators of me as I am of Christ. Now, that creates a little bit of a conundrum in our brain, doesn't it? Because all of us understand we should be able to freely, openly, and confidently post that statement, should we not? If we call ourselves Christians and we've been crucified to self and we live for him, we should, like Paul, be able to make the statement, therefore be imitators of me as I am of Christ. Because I should look like Christ. If I have died to self and live for him, church, I should look like Christ. And I should look like Christ when I'm eating out with a bunch of people at a restaurant. I should look like Christ. We got a phone call, 2 weeks ago? Hey, I just want you to know I'm a waitress at one of the local restaurants, and a group of people that claimed they went to Broadway Church of Christ came in, and they were real rude to me. I don't know her motive, but that's not a good look. It's not a good look when we're out in the community and we don't look like Christ. Not a good look. And I'll be the first one to say, I've been in those moments and I'm not presented a good look. Maybe I'm walking through Walmart and I say something off-colored. And Amanda will nudge me and she'll say, yeah, that sounds good coming from a preacher. You laugh? Should never come from my mouth. Because who hears that? We laugh about it, right? We laugh about our kids picking up bad habits, and we laugh and we go, wonder who they got that from. And oftentimes we're looking at the person in the mirror. But not if I'm an ambassador for Christ. Not if we're living the way we should be living. We don't always just get those phone calls, though. Sometimes we get emails that look like this. If you look on the front cover of your bulletin, if you have your bulletin, take it out. I want you to look at the front cover on it. There's a really cool picture that I think Brock Woolley took. That is your youth group at Cave-In Rock in Illinois. We went up there last Sunday night, and we are preparing for our teen retreat in December, and we talked about David and what it would have been like for him to be running from his enemies and hiding in these caves. It was a really neat experience, and something happened that day that I would have never expected. And it goes to prove this point that Paul makes. I think it was Judah that we went up to the bathroom, and we came back down, and while we were going up, there was two little old ladies. And we probably even made the comment, like they were barely moving down the stairs. And we thought, they're never going to make it back up the stairs. And by the time we got back from the bathroom, they were sitting at the entrance of the cave. And one of them reached out and they said, oh, you guys have a big group here. I said, yeah, we're from the Broadway Church of Christ, and we came down here for our Sunday night live wire, and we're going to sing in a little bit. That's all that was said. And she said, well, that's neat, and we carried on with our evening activities. On Monday, I got this email. They sent it to Broadway's info. Maybe you can remember meeting two older ladies when the youth group was at the cave. We listened when you all began to sing. I wanted you to know how much it touched our hearts to hear young people sing for the Lord. My friend Caroline is 85 and lost her husband of 63 years 2 years ago. This trip, we went to see some of her kids and grandkids and great-grandkids. Their family has been singing to the Lord most of those years. She was so touched that it brought tears to her eyes then and later on. She said, what a wonderful way to end the Lord's Day. So thank you for your ministry, and thank your teens for us. And then she addresses the teens, and they've all got this already. Teens, there's one thing to remember about this, is that you blessed the hearts of two little old ladies that you didn't even know or expect to encounter. Someone is always watching, and you can be a blessing or a stumbling block. Thank you all again for being such a blessing. When I die to self and I live for Christ, everybody I encounter should see me like the two little old ladies saw our teens that night. You want to know how to grow his kingdom? That's how. That we look like him, that we walk like him, that we talk like him, that we smell like him. I've been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And the life that I now live in this flesh, I'm going to live it by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. Which brings us to our third sentence. Not only am I crucified, yet I live. Not only do I no longer live for me, but live for him as his ambassador so people can look at me. But while I live here on this earth, I'm going to live it in faith. And I love this statement because I want to think about those men that I looked up that faked their death, that were running from something. We're all of us in this room are going to have days we're going to feel like running from something. We're going to have days where you're going to make these tongue-in-cheek remarks. I wish you would just come back today. I'm over it. We're going to have those days. But I'm going to give you two options. Would you rather live those days without faith in him, or would you rather live those days with faith in him? Knowing that no matter what happens in this life, if I have crucified myself and I no longer live for me, but live for him, one day I get to go home and be with him in heaven. And isn't that what Paul felt? How many times does Paul echo this sentiment? How many times do you see all of Paul's difficulty that he goes through, his near-death experiences? But doesn't he say this? For I have fought the good fight. I have kept the faith, and I have finished the race. And I love what he says after. Therefore, I have a crown of righteousness laid by in store for me. But not only for me, but to all those who long for his appearing. All those who are living their life longing for his return. Because I'm going to tell you one thing. We either are looking forward to him coming back or we're not. And if right now this morning you're sitting here not looking forward to his return, it's not a good place to be. Because we should have died to self to live for him. So the life that I now live in this flesh while I'm on this earth, I'm going to live it in faith knowing he's coming back. And that changes me. And it should change all of us. It should change who we are. It should change how we handle our business affairs. It should change how we talk to one another. It should change how we express our forgiveness and our grace and our mercy. It should change how we see people. When we die to self and live for him. When we think of the word crucify, yeah, it was extremely significantly important that Christ died. And it's extremely significantly important that we crucify self. So today and the rest of our lives, we live for him as his ambassadors. And we do it living in faith, knowing one day he's coming back. And he's got me through the hard times. And with him, I'm going to succeed. Have you crucified self? Maybe this morning you are thinking that you have not died to self. Maybe today you're continually living for self and selfish ambition and what you want in life. And my encouragement to you is for you to stop, to die. To die to that old self. To be part of this new creation that's only found new in him. Maybe this morning you need to seek out what that life looks like, or maybe you need to recommit your life to him. Maybe today it's time to die so we can live for him. If there's anybody here this morning who needs to respond to the invitation that he's always given, now's the time while together we stand and while we sing the song that's been selected.
How great the chasm